Quote, moments after President Trump ended his phone call with Ukraine's president on July 25th, an unsettled national security aide rushed to the office of White House lawyer John Eisenberg. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the top Ukraine advisor at the White House, had been listening to the call and was disturbed by the pressure Trump had applied to the Ukrainian president to investigate his political rivals. Vindman told Eisenberg, the White House's legal advisor on national security issues, that what the president did was wrong. Vindman, in Eisenberg's office, read out loud the notes he had taken of the president's call. Eisenberg, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, then suggested that the National Security Council should move records of the call to a separate, highly classified computer system. He's told that the president did something wrong on that call. He hears the notes from the trained national security official who is listening in, who believes that what the president did was wrong. His response is to lock up the notes. Washington Post reporting from Tom Hamburger. So the president is being impeached, from Carol Leonnig, Tom Hamburger, and Greg Miller, I should say, is the bylines there. The president is being impeached under proceedings approved by the House of Representatives just today. The president is being impeached for him trying to get a foreign country to help him out against the Democrats for 2020. But then there's immediately, that day, this other issue, the White House covering that up, hiding the evidence, or at least weirdly misfiling the evidence of what the president did. I mean, that's something the president couldn't do for himself. How does that factor into the impeachment inquiry? The White House lawyer, who apparently responded to these alarmed reports from a uniformed military officer that the president was doing something wrong, the guy who responded to that by saying, well, let's lock the notes up then, that lawyer, John Eisenberg, has now been summoned to appear before the impeachment proceedings against the president. He's been told he must appear on Monday. Will he appear? As we await that closed-door testimony from key officials like John Eisenberg and from others who have still been summoned for closed-door depositions, as of today, we are officially gearing up for a whole new phase of the impeachment proceedings, one that will play out before the public. Today's vote by the House to move forward with the impeachment of President Trump changes the whole framework of the impeachment process going forward. Joining us now is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, who is the leader on these proceedings in the House. Sir, thank you very much for your time. I know you have a lot of things to be working on right now.
It's good to be with you. So
the House has formally approved the process going forward. As by our count, we believe 13 or so witnesses have already testified. We know you have 4 more who you want to interview on Monday and you expect to interview on Monday. Do you feel at this point that you personally and your committee have a good understanding of what transpired? Are you in just the corroboration phase, but you feel like you have the facts? Or are there still fundamental parts of this story that you need to understand?
We've certainly learned an enormous amount, and when you consider that the call record only became public about a month ago, it's really quite astounding how much ground we've been able to cover. And I think we're hearing a reasonably consistent story about what happened months before that call, what happened in the weeks and months after that call. But there are still missing pieces, and there are still key witnesses that we want to bring in. And of course, there are still key witnesses who are resisting coming to testify. And, until they come in, until they're willing to do their legal duty and the constitutional duty, there are going to be pieces of this puzzle that the American people don't get to see. But I think when we do go to the public hearings and the American people have a chance to hear from these witnesses directly, they'll certainly get a pretty good picture of the president's misconduct.
We do have multiple reports now that seem to be mutually corroborative, if not exact, on the details about the White House having taken extraordinary action to essentially hide the record of the president's call that led to these impeachment proceedings in the first place. Can you give us any insight into how that fits into these impeachment proceedings? Do you view that as part of the misconduct that has given rise to the impeachment proceedings? Is that potentially going to give rise to some other sort of action or accountability for other people who did that, who weren't the president himself?
Well, I would say there are a few issues within the Ukraine portfolio that we're investigating in the Intelligence Committee, and, certainly issues around the conditioning of this well-sought-after meeting, this meeting that the president of Ukraine desperately wanted with the president of the United States to show the relationship he had with the most important patron of Ukraine, that is the United States, the conditioning of the military aid, also in order to get this political advantage, these investigations that would help the president's reelection campaign. But we're also looking at the broad issue of obstruction, of cover-up. And I think that the degree to which this highly classified system may have been improperly used to conceal what I think many must have recognized was a highly problematic, to put it in the most diplomatic of terms, call between the two presidents is one of the issues that we are looking at. But I think it fits into the broader category of how this administration has sought to obstruct, to cover up, to conceal the president's misconduct.
We know from Colonel Vindman's account that, at least according to him, he believes that there were important factual details and important proper nouns that were left out of the White House call notes about that call. He says, according to his testimony, that he wanted to correct those matters, but his suggested corrections, even though he was asked to correct the transcript, were not factored into the transcript ultimately. I guess I wonder if you feel like that's a material issue, if you feel like there's an importance for the committee to get to the bottom of what may have been the exact wording on that call and what may have been inaccuracies in those notes, and if you are going to pursue it, how you'll do so.
Well, one of the aspects of the resolution that we passed today authorizes me to begin releasing transcripts, and I would expect that process will begin as early as next week. Until we do release the transcripts, I really can't go into the substance of the testimony on that particular issue. That is, was this call record accurate? If it wasn't fully accurate, why wasn't it fully accurate? I think the public will get a sense of those issues. We certainly have inquired about them when we begin releasing the transcripts. And again, you know, the American people as well as the Congress will be able to weigh what's the significance of this? Does this go to an effort to conceal, or is there some other explanation? But until we have those released, I really can't go into the specifics. Okay,
you're making news here with us tonight already, that the news that those transcripts will start to be released next week. In terms of what the public is going to see here, I know that the rules as voted on in the House also have a provision for a public-facing report on your inquiry thus far. If you could hold on with us just for a moment, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you about that on the other side.
Certainly.
All right, we'll be right back with the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, the leader of the impeachment proceedings in the House, Congressman Adam Schiff. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.